Today we're going to be speaking to a Canadian politician who in his first term has made immense inroads into many different communities. He's the Deputy Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, MP for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, none other than Garnett Genuis. Garnett, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be with you today.
Pleasure to be with you as well. Garnett, let's start off by asking the question. You were recently voted the best parliamentarian in Canada. Is that right?
Well, that was last year.
They
just had the awards, and I didn't get it this year. So I've been eclipsed, but thank you for that. It was a real honor to have last year, and I spent a lot of time speaking about human rights issues, and I think the importance of Canada having a principled voice on the world stage and being an advocate for pluralism, for democracy, for human rights is something that really resonates with a lot of people. They want to see that happen.
And you've so far done amazing work on that. We've all watched many of your videos where you rise up in the House and ask questions and then go out in the community and speak about what you've done as well. You seem to have a particular interest on the Sri Lankan file when it comes to the Tamil human rights issues or Sri Lankan human rights issues. What brought that interest about?
I think Canada has an opportunity in general on the world stage to be a voice for a principled foreign policy that stems from our own experience, and also to use the international networks that we have to bring other countries along with us. And in the case of Sri Lanka, they're a fellow member of the Commonwealth, and it was really in the last government, it was through that Commonwealth Association that we were able to, by choosing to boycott the summit, make a very strong statement and lead the world in terms of putting pressure there around human rights. But also, I think we have a particular opportunity to connect with our diaspora communities and work collaboratively as a country, drawing on the knowledge and experience from diaspora communities who have a particular awareness of human rights. Some people are very critical in the mainstream media, let's say, about diaspora politics, but I think that Canada's diversity in terms of how it allows us to understand what's going on around the world can be a real source of increased effectiveness for our foreign policy. So it was really through the activity of the Canadian diaspora here that has helped me to understand the dynamics that are at play. And it's also through those associations like the Commonwealth that I feel we can have a particular impact on what's happening in Sri Lanka.
Diaspora definitely helps Canada interact with other countries, promote trade, promote culture, and a lot more other
absolutely
helpful stuff as well.
Yeah.
On the Sri Lanka file, lately there's been turmoil.
Yes.
What seemed to be a fairly stable government now has been shaken up by the entrance of Rajapaksa back into the fold of things. How do you see that?
Well, yes, and I mean, in general, on some of the human rights improvements and changes that we were all hoping to see, I think it's fair to say progress was very, very slow, even previously. But now we're seeing what I think very much appears to be and is going to be a backsliding in terms of democracy, human rights, freedom. And this is, of course, a concern not only for minority communities in Sri Lanka, like the Tamil community, but also for the majority in terms of the protection of their democratic rights, their freedoms, having voted in a prime minister who was now summarily dismissed by the president. This raises some real concerns. And I know many countries around the world have been vocal on this. I would like to see Canada do more. Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, through the organization he now chairs, which is a kind of a group of center-right political parties around the world, they have been very vocal on this. And Canada, as a country, our government should be taking a stronger stand. We see this around the world in general, I think now, where at one time there was a sense at which there was this sort of steady progressing march of democracy, of freedom, more countries that had been undemocratic in the past were becoming democratic. Now I think a lot of people have the sense that the momentum is moving in the opposite direction. And the reasons why that might be happening in each particular case are different and may respond to some local factors, but there are some common factors as well. One of them is the willingness of large authoritarian non-human rights respecting powers like China to support like-minded actors in the country. I think that's something we see in Sri Lanka, the relationship between Rajapaksa and the Chinese government. So this is something we're seeing in the world now that we need to be aware of and pushing back against.
Now that you've brought that up, I'll follow up on the rest later, but that's a very interesting point that you bring. Sri Lanka is a small little island south of India. China seems to want to have a lot of control over what happens in Sri Lanka, and Rajapaksa was very cordial with China. But he also recently made a trip to India and came back just before he now took over power in whatever way he did. How do you see all of this geopolitical matters happening from here? As someone who is very concerned about human rights and stability in government, what do you think is happening, and is there a recourse for this?
Yeah. Well, China has a terrible and I think worsening domestic human rights record. Your viewers will maybe be familiar with the crackdown we're seeing against the Christian community in China, the escalating terrible abuse of Uyghur Muslims in the western part of China. So there's a bad and worsening human rights situation in China, and they are prepared to offer their patronage to people who the West would not want to be doing business with. And so I think we do see the role of China in a number of different countries, and of course the port that China effectively controls in Sri Lanka. These provide big strategic advantages. Of course, we don't know all the substance of the conversations that may have happened between Rajapaksa and India, but I would think that India should be concerned about the strategic posturing of China in and around them. This is sort of we see what they're doing with Belt and Road and the South China Sea, and now there would appear to be efforts to have more and more control over things that are happening in Sri Lanka. So this is a concern for people in the Tamil community, but I think this should be a concern for all Sri Lankans and really people of the world everywhere. We see China deploying different tactics to try and influence the direction of politics, not only in their immediate backyard, not only in Asia, but also in other Western countries, in Australia, in Canada, and the U.S., elsewhere.
Not sure if this is a fair question to you, but what do you think the United States should be doing about this? I know Canada wants to raise the concerns, but we don't really have so much power as the United States would.
Yeah.
Where should the U.S. be at this point in time? Should they have?
Well, I think what we need to see from Western countries in general, and the U.S. as part of this, is a clearly communicated sense of confidence in the effectiveness and value of our political system, a political system that affirms the dignity of every individual, and as an extension of that sees the value of freedom, of pluralism, and of a system that aggregates the perspectives of the community. It doesn't just rely on the edicts of a narrow governing class. I think that system, it's not only a system that we like and enjoy, but it's also been the most successful system for bringing about human flourishing, for economic and technological development as well. And all of us need to have confidence in that system and be able to share and promote and engage that system. I think we need to resist an isolationist tendency to say, well, we shouldn't worry about what happens in other places, we should just focus on what happens here. Well, if we're not engaged in the advance of freedom and democracy and human rights, if we're not there, then others are going to be there. if we're not present and engaged, then it leaves space for China and Russia to be present and engaged in some of these places. And also a world in which freedom is advancing is a world that is safer for countries that are already free. This is the kind of confidence, boldness, and leadership that we need from the Western world in general. I think Canada has a role to play that. Obviously, the U.S. as the largest economically in terms of population within the Western world has a critical role to play in that as well.
Conservative MP Garnett Genuis உடன் பேசிக் கொண்டிருக்கின்றோம். ஒரு சிறிய இடைவேளையின் பின் மீண்டும் சந்திப்போம். இன்றைய இந்த சிறப்பு நிகழ்ச்சியில் கன்சர்வேட்டிவ் எம்பி கார்னெட் ஜெனிஸ் எங்களோடு கலந்து பல தகவல்களை பகிர்ந்து கொண்டிருக்கின்றார். இங்கே அவரோடு பேசுவோம். So let's bring that back to Canada. What do you think Canada could do, and what do you think Canada should do right now? Like under Prime Minister Trudeau's leadership, what should have been done, and what should he be doing right now?
Yeah. Well, I think we need stronger statements about human rights in Sri Lanka. I think we need to do more to hold perpetrators of serious human rights crimes accountable. In this Parliament, Conservatives put forward and successfully passed a bill bringing in something called Magnitsky sanctions. And Magnitsky sanctions are named for Sergei Magnitsky, who was a victim of terrible human rights abuses in Russia. But the principle is an international one. The principle is that it was an idea that came out of this particular case, which was that we should impose sanctions against individuals. Historically, sanctions have been something we think of as being against countries, and they're an appropriate tool in certain contexts, but they can also cause suffering for ordinary people in those countries. But the trend then in sanctions is to be more and more targeted to sanction the individuals who are involved in human rights abuses. So the idea of Magnitsky sanctions is, we say to individuals who have been involved in terrible crimes, you cannot move your money around. You can't travel. You can't take advantages of the things we associate with in the globalized world. The thing is, in many of these cases, where people are involved in an authoritarian regime, they are looking for that exit strategy. They want to know that if things go badly for them, if someone's about to do to them, exactly, then they can take their golden parachute and go live somewhere else. But Magnitsky sanctions is a way of saying, be careful what you do in terms of human rights, because if you cross certain lines, you will never get out, and you will have to stay home and face the music, whatever comes. So this is, I think, an important message, and we've passed that tool, Magnitsky sanctions, but it is up to the government to then list individuals who should be sanctioned under that Magnitsky structure. And so we were able to pass the bill through Parliament. But now it's up to the government to actually take the action to impose those sanctions. And so far, we haven't seen the use of Magnitsky sanctions against Sri Lanka. So that's one, I think, fairly obvious tool for holding people accountable who have been involved in crimes against the Tamils, against other minorities and other people within the country. So I talked about Canada speaking clearly, talked about holding people accountable. Another issue that's important for us is to be involved in that long-term conversation at the ground level about human rights and pluralism. We had something that the previous government created and was unfortunately since been canceled, but it was called the Office of Religious Freedom. And it dealt with religious freedom, but really the impact was broader than that, because it was engaged in funding projects on the ground level that helped build community and facilitate an understanding of pluralism. So the office was engaged in Nigeria in building networks of Christian and Muslim leaders who could work collaboratively together to diffuse tension. So if there was conflict, it wouldn't metastasize into something bigger because there were networks that existed between the different communities that could diffuse those tensions. In Pakistan, the office did a program in collaboration with the Aga Khan Foundation to develop textbooks that were supportive of pluralism. This is an issue I hear, by the way, in the context of Sri Lanka, is concerns about the education system. Is the education system encouraging people to see the value and dignity of other communities and recognize a common citizenship, or are the messages being received through education ones that
More
promote
divisive.
division? So us being involved, not just in being willing to fund anything that goes under the name education, but in actually supporting the development of curricular materials that are reflective of
Cohesion.
of our values. So, I mean, we had a project through that office in Sri Lanka as well. So these kinds of things which do not necessarily deal with just speaking out about the egregious cases in the moment, but rather thinking long-term about how to create the conditions in a society for a well-functioning pluralism. Those are the kinds of areas in which we need to be engaged as well.
Mm-hmm. You listed quite a number of different things that the government can be doing. Let's talk about the Magnitsky sanction. Mm-hmm. This was passed under the Harper government.
No, this was actually passed in this Parliament. So the
okay.
process was it was put forward by Senator Andrew Chuck, a Conservative senator, passed the Senate, and there were initial signals that under Stéphane Dion that the Liberals were going to oppose this. Actually, there was some signals and some speculation along those lines, but a credit to the work that was done by many civil society organizations. This bill, which was again sponsored by the Conservatives, we were able to create enough pressure that the government ultimately decided to support it, and they passed it. So this did pass in this Parliament with the support of the government. It was a Conservative initiative, but the pressure now needs to be to actually use it. It's a tool. It's now a legislative tool in the toolbox, but there is a need to actually use that tool, and if you don't use it, there's not a lot of value in it.
So the fact that the government is not using it is not because there's no names to add to the list. It's probably because of partisan politics? Would that be?
Yeah, I mean, they are using it in some cases, like they've been using it in the case of Venezuela, for example, and that's an important case to be using it in, of course. But there are some cases in which, like certainly, we were calling for a long time for more sanctions in the case of Burma, the genocide against Rohingya and other terrible human rights abuses against other minorities. Eventually, more people were added to the sanctions list, but that didn't happen until very late in the day, and we still haven't seen its use in the case of Sri Lanka. So, why that's the case? I mean, I think that often governments see a tension between what they see as kind of diplomacy and having other countries and other diplomats like you, and human rights on the other hand. And I think this maybe holds countries back from taking strong stands in terms of human rights. But I think we need to rethink the way we approach that a little bit, and that is to recognize that our values, our commitment to human rights, is not something that holds us back in international diplomacy. It's actually an asset.
Right.
If we're confident in terms of our values, and if we have an appeal to the peoples of the world that resonates with them, and that we can show from sincere motivation, from a willingness to be engaged, the power, the importance, the effectiveness of our values, I think we catalyze a more effective diplomacy than the kind of Metternickian compromise. We'll sacrifice, because if you sacrifice your values some of the time, then you don't really have credibility when you want to speak about issues in other cases.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you a hypothetical question.
Yeah.
If the Conservatives were in power today, how would you have used the Magnitsky sanction?
Well, I think the importance of that tool is that we look at the human rights activities of certain people and say, were these people involved in terrible abuses of human rights? And therefore we apply the Magnitsky Act in those cases. So I think, definitely in the case of Sri Lanka, we would not have canceled the Office of Religious Freedom. We would have continued to be engaged in that way. I think you would have seen stronger statements. But also on this particular point, you would see us identifying those that were involved in past and this new regime to say who can we clearly identify as deserving to be held accountable for some of the things that happened at the end of the Civil War, for example, and then imposing Magnitsky sanctions against those people. And also, I would say, doing that in concert with our allies. Other countries have brought in the Magnitsky Act. And just use an example from the previous Conservative government. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Canada was able to use our presence within the G7 to really catalyze a stronger international response. We were willing and able to say things about that Russian aggression that the Americans and the Europeans, for different reasons, were less willing to say. The Europeans, there's a greater economic interdependency. The U.S., level of caution for a variety of reasons at the time. But we were able to, through our clarity, pull the consensus of the G7 towards a stronger response in that case. But we were able to be most effective by using our membership in an international organization to pull the international response. And that's what I think we need to be doing in this case as well. Being willing to use the tools that we have and also highlighting these issues in fora and international fora that pull a broader international response to them.
It almost sounds like the current government doesn't really pay much attention to what's happening in Sri Lanka, or doesn't really pay much attention to human rights issues, where they clearly have the world stage where they could actually be pulling some strings and using their power to make some changes happen.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think we haven't seen much engagement with the government on the Sri Lanka issue at all, despite commitments that they made in the last election to that effect, and also in terms of human rights in general. This is a government that really prioritizes the symbol, and so they want to say we're the party of this, we're the party of that. But the proof is always in the pudding, and there just isn't very much pudding here.
There's exactly.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the Canadian politics. There's still about a year for an election?
About a year, yeah.
About a year. And I believe you're still going to continue championing human rights. What do you think the people that are watching this show can potentially do to sort of try and bring back the little bit of stability that was back in Sri Lanka? Can they talk to their MPs? Can they write to the Prime Minister? What can they do to get the government's attention?
Well, I think it's very important for people watching at home to engage with their local MP, make sure they understand that the situation in Sri Lanka is a priority for people within their constituency. And ask them to present ideas for concrete action, not to prioritize the statement over the action. I mean, in the opposition, we're a little more limited. We don't have the tools of government at our disposal. But especially for the government, what are the tools of effective engagement that are going to bring about change? It's been 3 years. We haven't seen much action from this government on this issue. But hopefully, in the time we have left in this Parliament, at least, public pressure will be able to see Canada more engaged in this with the direction that Sri Lanka is going. I mean, it's one thing when things were maybe not progressing or progressing slowly, but now with things actively moving in the wrong direction, there should be a much clearer case for Canada to be actively seized and involved.
Well, that's all the time we have, Garnett. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the great work that you do, and thank you for continuing to do that.
Thank you very much.
Well, hopefully we can catch up one more time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pleasure.
Take care.
நல்லது நேயர்களே, மற்றும் ஒரு நிகழ்ச்சியில் சந்திக்கும் வரை நன்றி, வணக்கம்.